Hi everyone, Suzanne here. I hope you're all well and welcome to Sew Custom. Today's video is going to be the making of this little number. So if you're interested in seeing that, then let's get started. Starting with the fabric, I'm using this satin backed crepe in this gorgeous blushed pink colour. I really like this fabric. And then onto my pattern pieces. So I have 3 pieces for my back and a tie. All of them are cut on the fold and ready to snip my notches. So I have a notch at the top and bottom of my bodice, at the top and bottom of my waist piece, at the top of my little skirt piece, all in the centre. So that's my pattern pieces for the back, notches all snipped, ready to go. And then onto my front. I have the same 3 pieces for my front and just snipping notches here. So I have a couple of tucks in the bodice. I'm just snipping the bottom of those. Snipping the center line of the bodice and then snipping the center line of the skirt. I'll match those up later on. And then for my waist piece on the front, my tie is attached this time. So now just to mark those tucks. So I've popped some pins in at the top of the tucks. And where those pins pierce the fabric, I'm just popping in a little dot with my fabric pen. And then from that dot down to the notch you see me snip, I'm going to draw a line. And I'm going to do that on all 4 tucks. And now I'm ready to pin. So I'm pinning just in the same way as I would a dart. So I'm popping my pin in through one dot, out through the other dot, and then matching up those lines you seen me draw. Matching up my notches at the bottom. So that's 1 tuck pinned, and of course again I do the same with the other 3, so that's how they look. So this is all of my pieces for the front, so my 2 waist pieces with ties attached, my 2 bodice pieces, and my 2 skirt pieces. So now I can get to some sewing. So I'm first of all going to sew up those tucks. So I'm back stitching at the bottom, stitching right along that pen line up to the dot, back stitching again. So that's how that looks. And then I've just given them a little bit of a press. So this is how they look. Nice and neat. And now I have a little bit of prep work to do on the back bodice as well. So this time I'm running a few gathers at the waist of the back bodice. So to do that, I'm just going to run 2 stitch lines quite close together at the center. I'm back stitching at the start and then letting my threads run off at the end. So that's my first line of stitches sewn. So I'm just going to move my needle over a little bit towards the right, back stitch again, and run a second line. My stitch length here is 5 millimeters. Pulling my threads at the end. So that's my 2 lines of gathering stitches done. So now I'm going to leave the threads that are underneath as they are, and I'm just going to pull on the threads that are on the top of the fabric. So just pushing those gathers along, holding onto the threads as I do. And of course I do the same the whole way across. So now I just need to check whether I've gathered that fabric down enough. So just popping my waist piece on top. The side seams seem to match up okay. So tying off those threads. So that's my back and my front bodices all prepped and ready to join together at the shoulder seams. So I'm just placing my front bodice on top of my back, wrong sides together. I'm going to French seam all of the seams on the inside. So to do that, I'm just sewing at half of my seam allowance, back stitching at the start and the end. So that's how that looks. And then just trimming that seam allowance down by about 2/3. And now to press. So I just want to press that seam as flat as I can get it. This will just make the French seam nice and neat. I'm going to fold on that seam line so that my fabric is now right sides together and pin and ready to stitch.
So again, at half of my seam allowance, back stitching at the start and the end, and that's my shoulders French seamed. Nice and neat, everything tucked away inside. So I've just given them a little bit of a press. So now that my front and back is joined, I'm ready to stay the neckline. So I just want to try to make sure that the neckline doesn't stretch out too much while I'm working on the bodice. So to try and minimize that stretching out, I'm running a tiny little stitch the whole way around the neck, from one side of the front up around the back to the other side. And I'm stitching here at a couple of millimeters inside my seam allowance. So that's how that looks. So now I'm ready to finish off my neckline, and this time I've chosen a facing to do that. So I have two front pieces and a back piece, which I've ran some interfacing along, and now I'm ready to join at the shoulder seams. So laying my front over my back and pinning, ready to stitch. So my fabric is right sides together this time, and I'm stitching at my 1 centimeter seam allowance, back stitching at the start and the end, and once pressed, I'm ready to finish off the outer edge of my facing. So to do that, I'm just going to run a stitch line which I'll use as a guide for pressing. So I'm running that stitch line right along the outer edge at about half of my seam allowance. So you can see that here. And then right along that stitch line, I'm going to fold and press. So the guideline is just going to help me stay as accurate as I can be the whole way around the facing. So once I've given it its first press, I'm going to fold again and give it another press. So I'm doing a double folded hem here. That will just mean that this edge is nicely finished off, no raw edges showing at all. So I've done that the whole way around and pinned, and now I'm ready to stitch. So I'm stitching right along that crease line on the inside, using a little bit of a longer stitch length, trying to stay as close to that edge as I can get, back stitching at the start and the end. That's how that looks. Super neat and tidy. So now my facing is all prepped and I'm ready to place it on the bodice. So I'm just going to line up. I have a notch at the center of the back, lining that up with the bodice, lining up my shoulder seams and pinning the whole way around. And ready to stitch. So stitching here at my 1 centimeter seam allowance, back stitching at the start and the end, and I've started at the center of the back neck and working my way towards one of my front pieces. I'll do the same on the other side, and that's how that looks. So now I just need to trim off that seam allowance. And just like the shoulder seams, I'm taking off about 2/3 of that seam allowance the whole way around. So once trimmed, I'm pressing my facing away from the bodice, making sure that my seam allowance underneath is butted up against the facing. And now I'm ready to understitch. And the understitching is just going to help to keep everything lying nice and flat. So again, starting at the center of the back neck, sewing as close to the seam as I can, using a little bit of a longer stitch length, back stitching at the start and the end, and that's how that looks. Super neat and tidy. So off camera, I've just given that a nice press, and that's my neckline all finished. So to complete the bodice, I only have 2 more things to do, the first of which is to finish my side seams. So again, I'm French seaming here. So I've placed my fabric wrong sides together and I'm stitching at about half of my seam allowance. And off camera, I'm just going to trim down that seam allowance, give it a nice press, turn my fabric so that it's right sides together and stitch that seam for the second time. Just in exactly the same way as I did the shoulder seams. So stitching at half of my seam allowance, back stitching at the start and the end, and that's my side seams done. So again, I've given them a nice press so everything's nice and neat on the inside. And now to finish the bodice, I just want to add some cuffs. So I've just cut myself a couple of rectangles of fabric, and I just need to join the short ends. So laying them right sides together this time and pinning, and stitching at my 1 centimeter seam allowance, back stitching at the start and the end. So now just to give those a little bit of a press, I've snipped that seam allowance in the center and I'm pressing above and below that snip to opposite sides. Then pressing the whole lot so that it's wrong sides together. And now I'm matching up the seam that you've just seen me sew with the underarm seam and my raw edges with the raw edges of my bodice. And pinning and ready to stitch. So again, at my 1 centimeter seam allowance, back stitching at the start, trying to stick to my 1 centimeter seam allowance the whole way around. And that's how that looks. And I've just finished this edge on the overlocker. So here I'm just understitching just to hold that seam down and make sure everything sits where it should be. So I'm stitching just to the left hand side of the seam you just seen me sew on the bodice side this time, using a little bit of a longer stitch length, back stitching at the start and the end, and that's how that looks. And from the inside, super neat and tidy. And now just to give that cuff a good press, and that completes my bodice. So I've got those cuffs all nice and neatly attached. Got my shoulder seams nicely French seamed along with my side seams. Got my facing all in with that double folded hem, my tucks in the front and my gathers in the back. So now I can move on to my skirt pieces. So I have 1 piece for my back and 2 pieces for my front. So I'm just going to line those up wrong sides together at the side seams, pin and ready to stitch. Again, I'm French seaming here, so just stitching at half of my seam allowance first of all, trimming off that seam off camera, pressing my fabric right sides together, making sure that seam is right along the edge, and stitching then at half my seam allowance again to finish the French seam. So that's one side, and of course I do the same on the other. And this is how it looks. So now to finish off the edge of the hem. So I'm going to do exactly the same thing here as a finish as I did on the facing. So I'm running a guideline at about half of my seam allowance the whole way along the outer edge of this little skirt piece. So that's how that looks. And now just to press, fold again and press. So I've done that off camera and pinned everything in place. And now I'm ready to stitch. So again, just stitching right along that crease edge, using a little bit of a longer stitch length, trying to stick to that crease edge the whole way along, back stitching at the start and the end. So that's how that looks, nice and neat. So now I just need to do the same thing with those front edges. So I've already ran my guideline. I'm going to press along the guideline, fold again and press, pop in some pins and stitch. And that's how that looks. So that's my bodice complete and my skirt piece complete. So I need to attach both of those to my waist, but before I do that, I've just got to deal with the tie that will go on one side. So I've just folded it in half along its length, right sides together and pinned, and stitching here at my 1 centimeter seam allowance. Little pivot at my corner, back stitching at the start and the end, So that's how that looks. I'm just going to trim my corners and give it a bit of a press, and you can see the result of that here. So now that my tie is complete, I'm ready to tackle my waist pieces. So I have 3 pieces, a front piece with my tie attached, a back piece, and a front piece without the tie attached. So I'm first of all going to join a front piece with tie attached to my back at the side seam. And then on the other side of my back, I'm going to tack in place my tie. So once pinned, I'm stitching the side with the tie attached at my 1 centimeter seam allowance. And then on the other side, my separate tie, I'm stitching at about half of my seam allowance. I'm just sort of tacking this in place for now. I will attach it firmly in place on the next step, which is to place the other side of my front with my back at the side seam with the tie. So just pinning that in place, and as I say, stitching this time at my 1 centimeter seam allowance. Back stitching at the start and the end. So that completes my waistband. So I've pressed my seam allowance open. I have my separate tie attached to one side and my combined tie on the other. And I've repeated that process again, minus the separate tie. So you can see that at the top of the screen. So this will be my facing piece for the waistband, which I'll come back to later. So now I want to place the waistband on the skirt piece to start with. So I'm lining up my front edges, my side seams and pinning, and ready to stitch the whole way around. So I'm stitching here at my 1 centimeter seam allowance, back stitching at the start, trying to stick to my seam allowance the whole way around, and back stitching at the end. So that's my waistband attached to my skirt. Now I'm ready to attach it to my bodice. So I'm just going to line up the top piece of my waistband to the bottom of my bodice, right sides together, and pinning. So doing the same as I did on the skirt, lining up my edges, my side seams, my centre back, and ready to stitch. So stitching this time just a little bit inside my seam allowance, back stitching at the start, and back stitching at the end. So that's my bodice and skirt now attached to either side of my waistband. So I now need to add that facing piece I showed earlier. So I'm going to add that first of all to the bodice side. So I'm lining up my facing piece with the bodice, right side of the facing with wrong side of the bodice, and just pinning the whole way around. Ready to stitch, this time at my 1 centimeter seam allowance. So I'm starting at the centre back, stitching, as I say, at my 1 centimeter seam allowance, the whole way this time, right to the end of the tie, pivoting at my corners, and back up again until I reach the edge of the bodice, where I'm going to back stitch and then snip into that seam allowance. So you can see that here, I'll just snip those seam edges. That will just help when I press my seam allowance in underneath on the next step. And then starting again at the centre back and working my way to the other side. And this time I have a straight edge, which I'm just pivoting at that corner and sewing right up to the bodice edge. So you can see that here. So I'm very close to finishing. I just have one more line of stitching to sew in order to complete this little top. And in preparation for that, I've just folded over the seam allowance from my facing in underneath and pinned it in place. And now stitching on the outside of the bodice, through that waistband, right through the facing in underneath, using a little bit of a longer stitch length, trying to stick right along that seam edge the whole way across, back stitching at the end, and this is how that looks. Super neat and tidy. And off camera, I've just popped in a little button and buttonhole to the underside of my wrap just to hold that in place. And you can see here that's my hole facing in, and with that, this little top is complete. So I have my waistband all attached, that beautiful skirt piece all hemmed, my gathers in the back, and then on the front I got that tie nicely attached on both sides, my button and buttonhole on the inside, nicely French seamed along the side seams and shoulder seams, my facing all attached, nicely finished off again, and my cuffs. Those lovely tucks in the front. Done! And this is what it looks like on. So I could not be more pleased with how this has turned out. I love everything about this. I love that little skirt piece, the length of it, the shape of it. I love the shape of the V. I love that it's not too low. I love the tucks at the front, the gathers at the back, that tie at the waist, the cuffs on the end of the sleeves. I could not be more pleased with how this has turned out. Love this one.
So I really hope you guys enjoyed the video. I hope you found it useful. If you did, give it a thumbs up. If you've not yet subscribed, please do, and I shall see you in my next one. Bye folks!